Hello, this interview is made possible by the View Conference. I'm your host, Jerry Orrs from Kids First, and right now we are with Rob Bredow. He is the Senior Vice President, Executive Creative Director, and Head of Industrial Light and Magic. Rob, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So my first question is, leading a company like Industrial Light and Magic is a big job. It's a massive company. They have locations all over the world. They're constantly working, constantly innovating. So could you talk a little bit about what the day-to-day life is like leading Industrial Light and Magic?
My days vary quite a bit. Often I'll be talking with some of the filmmakers and show runners that we get to work with. I get to spend a lot of time talking to them about what the future might be, what their challenges are, what they're looking to do on their future shows, and make sure that we're positioning ILM so that we can be an assistant, so we can be a creative partner to those people that are creating the kind of shows that we want to be a part of and get to be a part of. It's really an amazing opportunity. And of course, that's one really fun part of the job. There's also a lot of things that it just takes to run a company like this. We're in 5 countries. So when something like COVID comes around, just the operations of getting everyone safe and remote and working from home, there's a lot of questions that come up, and there's a big team of people. It's certainly not just down to me. There's a big team of people that are doing all the heavy lifting to make that possible. But I get involved in a lot of those details as needed as well.
Mm. I would love to talk about the logistics of transferring because of COVID, because this is really just unprecedented. But before we go to that, I want to talk a little bit more about your role, as leading this company is not an easy job. For most roles in film, it's kind of limited to one thing. You're either on the business side, the creative side, or the technical side. Industrial Light and Magic is combining all three. It's a company, it has quarterly reports, it is a standard company that needs to make profits, but it's also a creative industry, visual effects artists, it's an art form. It's also a technical job. There's a lot of technology involved in getting the work done. So how do you combine those three often conflicting viewpoints in your work?
Well, I mean, we are lucky to work with so many creative and talented people with all of this experience that the people at ILM already have. So I get to do it with a lot of other folks. And you're completely right. There's all the technology and innovation that we invest in pretty heavily at ILM. And then there's the simple, not simple, but the more straightforward or the operational components of the job, which is complicated across all of our operations. And there is a bit of a balancing act there for sure, determining where to invest our future R&D efforts, figuring out where the shows are going in terms of what is going to be the next generation of things, what are going to be the kind of things we want to be able to do in virtual production. And then combining that with just good business sense, making sure that we are setting ourselves up for a long future. The company's already been around for more than 45 years, which is amazing to have that sort of legacy. And you definitely want to paint a future that is a nice long future for the company as well.
Something else that I really like about your career is that you transitioned from being a part of the creative process, jobs like visual effects supervisor, CG supervisor, senior technical director. Those are all part of the creative process. You're getting your hands dirty in the work. Now it's still a part of the process, but it's overseeing the process, it's guiding the process, it's creating the entire process itself. So could you talk a little bit about that transition from being a part of the work to leading the entire gestalt of it, I guess you could say?
Yeah. Well, when Kathy Kennedy and Lynwyn Brennan, who are my bosses, when they asked me to do this job, they really did it with an eye towards having somebody with a creative background at the head of the company, because it's the most important thing for our company is to be focused on the creative first. And of course, all those other things you mentioned in terms of running the business, that's an important responsibility. And of course, we have to run a responsible business in order to have a thriving company where we can do all of this fun, creative work. But we wanted to make our main thing be about the creative. So that is my main focus. That's why my title starts with creative. And we really focus on supporting the creative, whether that's a filmmaker or whether that's our creatives in the company, and then making sure everything else is designed to enable and support that. So when we're working on a really hard show, some of my favorite meetings are we get pulled into a room, we have a huge challenge, we're not quite sure how we're going to solve it, and we get really good minds together and say, okay, well, we can take a risk here. We're pretty sure that person's going to be able to figure out that one really hard problem, and we'll know in 2 weeks. And do we need to have a plan B for that or not? Getting to do some of that creative problem solving is actually really fun.
It sounds like you found a role you're really passionate about. And in visual effects, that's not easy. There's a lot of different roles out there for people interested in the industry. Just aside from the leadership roles, just in the technical and creative side, there's rigging, there's texturing, modeling, there's tracking, and there's compositing. That just skims the surface. It gets deeper and deeper and crazier and crazier. So how did you find the role that best fit you and your style?
My background when I first came into the visual effects business was really more on the technical side. I knew how to do some computer programming. I was really interested in how computer graphics worked. And I was interested in learning how to put those shots together. And then I really had the benefit of getting to work with incredible artists over my entire career who really helped me grow and learn the filmmaking, the shot composition side, the artistic side that is a huge percent of what makes great looking visual effects come together. And that mixture is really fun. And it is one of the things that I really love about visual effects. And for people thinking about whether visual effects might be a career for them, there are all sorts of jobs. There's highly technical jobs for people who like computer programming and engineering at the very highest levels, research and development. There are very production-oriented jobs for people who like to organize huge amounts of shots and strategize on how we're going to organize hundreds of really talented artists to get work done. That is an incredibly important job, and something that doesn't always get talked about a lot is how important those production roles are to the success of today's visual effects. And then there's the positions you were talking about, compositing, putting shots together, or modeling, or texturing, or all the different things, animating, the things that really put the work on the screen and is directly contributing to the pixels that you see in the film. That's another really fun part of the job. So you have all of these different specialties in visual effects. So there's actually a lot of different work for people with different interests and skill sets.
And I love that too about visual effects, that there's a place for everyone in the visual effects industry. Now, there's of course downsides of the visual effects industry, which we are seeing now. Because of COVID, the industry is completely dealing with something that's never been prepped for, working from home in every single sector of the industry. And also, the work that visual effects gets is from movies and TVs. It's from talented filmmakers that are not making films right now because of the dangers of COVID. So how has ILM adapted to the COVID pandemic, and what suggestions would you give to visual effects artists who are looking at this industry in a major situation and are honestly a little bit worried about the future?
Yeah, it's understandable that there would be some concern, and I wouldn't be being honest if I didn't say there was some impact to everybody. Everybody in visual effects is impacted, but I think there's very few industries that aren't impacted in some way, right? Almost every industry has been impacted in some way. One of the great things about visual effects in the filmmaking process is we are a highly technical team on the whole, and we're pretty smart and flexible. So when you looked at all of the departments in the filmmaking process that were impacted by COVID, visual effects actually was one of the first to react. We had the situation in our San Francisco office, for example, where we got, I think, about 10 hours notice between the time that they made the announcement that you needed to lock down your offices and we had to be working at home. So we went from having one office in San Francisco to having hundreds of offices in San Francisco in under 24 hours, which was really amazing how resilient the teams were, how smart our technical teams were to help us pull that off, and really how flexible our artists were. And production teams and engineers, everybody who works there to make that possible. And you saw that ripple across the world as we adjusted to this new reality. So there are definitely some impacts. When things aren't shooting, there can't be any post-production. There can't be any visual effects when movies aren't shooting or TV shows aren't shooting. Fortunately, there was a lot in the can before we had this. And if this lockdown on shooting doesn't last too much longer, I think we'll see a bit of a blip going forward, but the work will be back. If it extends longer, there'll be a bigger blip. There'll be a bigger impact. But some of that initial panic about how much work was going to go away, we've actually seen a little bit of the other aspect of that at ILM, where there's been a lot of alternative content, a lot of other things that people would like to use visual effects for, to do things that we can do right now while you can't go out and shoot. So we've had a bit of a resurgence of variations of types of work, which has been really great because it keeps our artists and teams really busy.
That's fascinating that you guys were able to adapt. Not only that, the industry adapted to your new resources and providing you new sources of work. Now, in terms of the working visual effects artist, even when things are normal, it's not an easy job. It's a very demanding job. The visual effects industry has extremely strict deadlines because the work needs to be done by the release date of the film, and often that requires artists working day and night, sleeping in the office to get the work done. So, what are your suggestions for artists to have a healthy work life balance to make sure the visual effects part of their life doesn't become their entire lives?
Yeah, I think that is exactly the advice, which is try to not let the visual effects part of your life become your entire life. And that's really a big focus at Industrial Light and Magic, is to make a place where you can have a reasonable work-life balance. And that doesn't mean we never get into a spot where we have to do overtime. What we do, we run into times where we have to do overtime and long hours. But if people are sleeping under their desks, we're doing something wrong. That means we didn't plan properly. It means we didn't hire enough people. One of the really nice advantages of having 5 studios and hundreds of artists in each of our studios is when something changes at the last minute on one of the films, rather than trying to see if the 40 artists in London who are working on that show can just do extra hours to get it done, we can actually say, what if we added this team over here to that to make sure we can deliver on this deadline without grinding people and exhausting people, because it's just not good for your career. It's not good for a long-term solve. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. There are times where you get crunched and you have to spend some weeks with some pretty long hours, but then hopefully you have time to recover after that. And it feels like you can find a healthy balance in there. And that's certainly something we are always striving for. I do think visual effects is growing up a little bit. When I first started in visual effects, the first movie I worked on was Independence Day, and I worked on it for 4 months. I did a whole bunch of work on the show. I slept under my desk for most of those 4 months to get that show out the door. And if we were doing that today, still all these years later, I think we'd be making a big mistake.
Mm. It's interesting to hear that the company is evolving and maturing, and I'm sure a lot of people, when they hear the word Industrial Light and Magic, they're a little bit in awe because it, like you said, it's over 40 years old, while the visual effects industry is not considered much older than that. It's one of the biggest, one of the oldest in the industry, and it has always stayed successful. Even before Independence Day with E.T. and Jurassic Park and Star Wars A New Hope, it was defining the industry. So what do you think allowed Industrial Light and Magic to take such a leading role in what is now one of the biggest industries in filmmaking?
The biggest thing that ILM has consistently done over time is invest in innovation and invest in research and development. And that's something we still do today. A recent example of that is with Stagecraft, where we created a virtual set for people to be surrounded in 360 degrees, and it would provide both the lighting and the background that you could photograph a digital environment with a real camera and see those shots come to life in front of your eyes on set. So that's a recent innovation that ILM has helped create with a lot of partners, a lot of help, and under the leadership of somebody like Jon Favreau, who had this vision of doing this virtual production in a totally new way. So it's really exciting to get to be a part of those things. And that's something that ILM has done time and time again. You look all the way back in the history of ILM, whether it's the way the motion control was done or the way the camera was moved on those initial rigs in Star Wars, all the way to today when you look at something like Stagecraft and these giant LED stages that are coming to life around the world.
You know, I remember when they first released the demo of the stagecraft technology you're talking about that people can see in The Mandalorian. That was maybe a year, 2 years before the release of The Mandalorian. It was a really short gap. And even when I saw the stagecraft, I was thinking, wow, I can't wait for this to be implemented. We didn't have to wait long. Something I love about The Mandalorian is that even though it has very cutting-edge technology like the virtual productions, it also has old-age methods like puppetry, like Baby Yoda has some puppetry scenes. So why do you think it's important for artists to still learn and practice these age-old, very classic, very ancient techniques in a world where we're constantly innovating, creating new technologies?
Yeah, the important thing about the technology is not the technology itself, right? It's the way it empowers the artist. So when we get a new tool, it's just a new paintbrush. It's a new tool and a new way of creating something, an image on the screen that we can all see and hopefully believe. The core skills that it takes to bring these characters to life, those are the same. And whether you're implementing those with puppets, which we love getting to use puppets whenever we can, or the latest CG techniques. You know, maybe people don't even know that Baby Yoda is half a puppet and half CG, because the puppet can only do so many things, right? A physical puppet can only do so many things, but that doesn't mean the puppet was any less important. The puppet was incredibly important. It defined the range of motion, it defined how the character really felt. And then we tied ourselves to that with our digital character. So our digital character felt just as believable, hopefully. No one even knows which shots are which. And it was funny, I think I saw a headline talking about the revival of puppetry, which it's not a revival of puppetry. Puppetry has always been a huge part of Star Wars movies, and it led with a giant baby Yoda image. And I called up the visual effects supervisor and I said, Richard, is that one all CG or is that a puppet? He's like, actually, that's an all CG shot, but nobody needs to know, right? Because it's not so much just about the mechanism we're using to create the pictures. It's the believability and the artistic work that goes into it. And they definitely complement each other. The latest digital techniques and the latest practical techniques, that's what's really fun about visual effects is you get to put it all together.
I think we're all really excited to see more blending of these age-old techniques and these new techniques. And a couple weeks back, the View Conference hosted a talk with Hal Hickel. It was really fascinating hearing how these techniques and these technologies not only impacted the production of the show, but the animation of the show as well. But going back to the real... Go ahead.
I'm very excited for everyone to get to see the new season. We're working on it right now, and it's very exciting. It's very, very exciting.
I'm very excited too. I mean, the virtual production technology is just amazing, and how you guys implement, especially interior scenes, it's just mind-blowing what you guys were able to do. Now, going back to the real world, there are some other issues that the visual effects industry is facing. For example, the industry has had a long-time challenge of incorporating people of color and women in the creative process. So what do you think that the industry can do to ensure that people from all walks of life are part of the visual effects industry?
It's a huge priority in visual effects right now. And it should have been a huge priority like this even earlier, because we have a real problem. We do not have the right kind of diversity of the people behind the camera, the people at the computers making the visual effects that we need. If you look at almost every stat around the world, for most visual effects houses, we don't have the diversity. And that means we're missing people of different races, we're missing people of different ethnicities, we're missing people of different genders. And I just want to say, like, every time I get a chance to say it, I just want to say, please apply, please look at our industry. If you're a woman, if you're a person of color, if you're somebody who, when you look at me, you don't look exactly like me, I want you to be part of our industry. I want you to be part of our company, because we need a broad, an inclusive, a diverse group of people who are working on inventing the future in this business. And if that interests you, we want you to be a part of it. And there's a bunch of things we can do. We can do better. We can do things like this, which is come out and say it literally like we have a problem and we want to fix it. And that's one thing we can do. We can also be more involved in going out and recruiting, because I think one of the problems is we as an industry haven't been great at finding people who want to do this and saying, hey, here's a job for you. We've been great at finding certain people in the industry. We certainly have some great people in our industry, but we can do a much better job looking for that talent, because right now we're missing some of the best talent out there. And if that's you, we want you part of our industry. We want you to come work for us.
The next generation is definitely going to be a bigger group of visual effects artists than the last generation. Probably the generation after that will be even bigger. The visual effects industry is growing fast, and there's more and more people interested. And maybe some people are now interested based off what you've been saying in this interview. So what advice would you give to them? Because the industry is constantly changing, either from technology or just the way films are made. It's constantly changing. So what advice would you give to the next generation of artists?
There's a lot of different things you can do, but I think one of the things that is really key is something you were referring to earlier, which is learn the artistic part of the job, learn the trade part of the job, the thing that you're most interested in, whether that's sculpting or painting or composing shots with photography, which is an area that I really like for lighting, or if you're really into math and science and you want to do some engineering or effects animation, that's another area. Find the things that are really appealing to you and really pour yourself into growing those skills, and make sure it's something you love, because you've already pointed out it's not the easiest industry in the world. There's tight deadlines. There's quite a bit of pressure when you're working on these really big films and TV shows. But I think it's also extremely rewarding if it's something that you have an aptitude for, that you have built up your skills and you can actually see your work represented on the screen. That can be really, really satisfying. So I encourage you to find an area that interests you and just get really good at it. Make sure you love it and you have some aptitude for it, and then just really pour into that, because I think it can be a really rewarding industry.
I think that's some amazing advice. Rob, thank you so much for talking to me all about the visual effects industry in ILM.
Thanks so much for having me, Jerry.
Absolutely. For our viewers, Rob Bredow has also published a book about his experience of being the visual effects supervisor for Solo, a Star Wars story. It's a really cool photography book. I recommend you all check it out. On top of that, Industrial Light and Magic has a lot of great upcoming films to look forward to, but they also have a lot of classic films that really show the revolution the visual effects industry over the decades. Make sure to check them all out. If you're interested in visual effects and interested in The Mandalorian, the View Conference has also done an interview with Hal Hickel, who is the animation supervisor for The Mandalorian. Make sure to check out that interview. Speaking of the View Conference, this interview is made possible by the View Conference. The View Conference is a yearly CG event that is happening both online and in person in Italy between October 18th and October 23rd. For information on how you can get tickets and attend events like these, make sure to go to ViewConference.It. I'm your host, Jerry Orris from Kids First. Bye!